Today I wanted to talk to you about how you construct and deliver an audience-centered speech. This is really just an overview which to kind of get you started this semester, because we'll be talking about lots of the pieces in this process at greater length this semester. Perhaps the best way to start is to talk about how the ancient Greeks talked about the art of rhetoric. Again, this is specifically from the writings of Aristotle, where he talked about the five parts or the canons of rhetoric, and those are the invention process, the disposition process, style, the role of delivery, and memorization. So actually that fifth canon, memory, we talk about that as the lost canon, not because we've forgotten it, but because in our modern day era, we don't think having a memorized speech is as important as it was for the ancient Greeks. And for the ancient Greeks, it wasn't just specifically having memorized entire orations, though certainly elocution and the ability to present an entire speech from memory was important to them, but it was really also more based upon the fact that the ancient Greeks were an oral culture, and for them you couldn't necessarily, at least certainly prior to the 7th century BC, when literacy was not widespread, you couldn't just go write down your speech and then have an outline or a manuscript which you could then refer to when you spoke. So in an oral culture, memory is the most important skill that an orator has, because your arguments are in your head. And in fact, the Greeks talked about a notion called topoi, which basically are places in the orator's head that he or she goes to find stock arguments, which are standard ways of making a particular case, a particular use of a metaphor or a simile or a particular cause and effect structure. And topoi were places that rhetors could go to, and they often would talk about how you would in your mind imagine a house and how the different arguments could be placed in different places in the house, as you could kind of visually in your head go through an argument structure by finding the place in the house, the topoi, where that particular argument was located. So although we can talk about doing a memorized presentation, we tend not to do that. And with our ability to write our arguments down, write our outlines down, to go to written sources for research, memory is not as important a canon for most speakers. Now certainly I would say maybe the one exception would be in legal rhetoric, where lawyers will often have to go to different case law almost on their feet sometimes, thinking about where they need to go look up a particular precedent and be able to argue that precedent sometimes on the spur of the moment as a case particularly evolves. But again, this is not a class in forensic rhetoric, so memory will not be as important for us. But those other four canons of rhetoric really are the kind of the building blocks of a good public speech. So invention, of course, is the initial process that the speaker goes through when you're figuring out your topic, and inventing both your topic and your general purpose, and then your specific purpose. So for example, when we talk about rhetoric, we really talk about three different types of speeches, three different categories into which pretty much all speeches fall, and those are speeches to inform, speeches to persuade, or speeches to entertain. And the Greeks referred to those as epideictic rhetoric, which is speeches to entertain, forensic rhetoric, which is rhetoric to argue a particular case, policy-based rhetoric, and obviously informative rhetoric. So when we're talking about speeches to inform, obviously you want your audience to understand something, to be better acquainted with a particular area of knowledge, to explore a particular topic in greater depth, to come out of that speech knowing something about that content. In a persuasive speech, obviously you want your audience not just to have knowledge, but also to have their attitudes or their beliefs possibly changed as a result of your speech, and maybe even in some cases you may be calling for them to engage in a particular action, like vote for a particular candidate, sign a petition, become an organ donor, do some sort of action as a result of being persuaded by you. And in speeches to entertain, again, the ones that we're most common with would be toasts at a wedding, or a ceremonial speech, a roast, or a toast, or a speech at a funeral, or a graduation, or some type of celebratory event or memorial type of an event. So we'll be looking at examples of epideictic, forensic, and informative rhetoric this semester, professional examples that we can analyze for their effectiveness. So when you're deciding on your